My name is Mike. I live in Austin, Texas. I apologize if this gives you seizures. I work for Mozilla, and I work with Firefox. It's a web browser, and I work on the Web Compatibility team. And I'm going to explain what that means to you all. Lol. Anyways, so this was a joke. So Firefox, it's free for today only. If you use the code WebRebels, you can download it. You have to put in the wow, wow, wow part, or it doesn't work. Otherwise, we charge you. All right, so that's hilarious. So what I'm going to be talking about is web compatibility. And you may have heard that term. You may not have heard that term. I had a discussion with someone at Mozilla who said, that's a terrible thing to talk about. And I disagree. So we're going to talk about a number of things. But who remembers when Firefox looked like this? Everybody's raising their hand, right? I don't actually remember. I started using the internet just a few years ago. But web pages were different back then. This was 2004-ish. And so you've got all this really old legacy content. Web pages are changing. We're adding new things to the browser. We're adding new things to the JavaScript language. And so we're trying to figure out, like, the theory is all websites should work in your browser. Anyone who's made a web page or app knows that's not so easy. And the way I try to think about this is, like, why is this important, right? So I came up with this amazing metaphor at 2 a.m. when the sun came up, as it does here in Norway. And so you think about like a drink that's really, like, you love it so much you want to share it with everyone, right? So in Norway, this is Norwegian for really good drink, I was told. I don't know how that's pronounced, but where I come from, we don't have that drink, but we have juice. I live in Texas, so we drink a lot of juice, I guess. So imagine you have this juice, and it's so good, you want to share it with everyone, right? Like, you don't want to keep this juice just for yourself. Like, even weird little kids deserve this juice. Okay, so I hate the metaphor already, but the web is like the juice, right? Like, the web is so important, everyone should have access to it, and everyone should have access to what's on the web. That's part of my dance. I was supposed to start dancing, I'm sorry. Can we do that again? So in reality, it's not quite like that, right? Like, we end up often with different experiences on the web. So if anyone here doesn't speak Spanish, it doesn't matter, because you can read numbers. So on the right-hand side, we have this message in English saying it's a 19-minute bike ride to Florida State University. On the left-hand side, same message in Spanish, but for some reason, it's a 20-minute bike ride. Same path, different experiences. We'll leave it at that. And this can happen on the internet, right? So this is a super popular website, I'm told, in Japan. I don't know if that's true or not. But here we have confirmation in the front row. Excellent. Here on the right, that's what this looks like in iOS Safari. And there on the left is what that used to look like in Firefox for Android. And that seems bad. Not just a Japanese phenomenon. I'll go back if you want to take a picture. There we go. Not just a thing that happens in Japan. So OkCupid, super awesome website. I'm not sure what they do. A social network of sorts. So you can tell, right? Like, iOS Safari, old Firefox for Android. Okay, that's kind of crappy. And so web compatibility is a bit like what we do on our team is we're plumbers of the web, right? We're trying to understand, like, why everything is broken. Like, what have you people done, is what I say a lot. And so in this talk, we're just going to kind of do, like, a greatest hits of, like, watching car crashes or whatever, ambulance chasing. I'm not sure what the expression is or how that translates in Norwegian. We're going to look at broken things. So JavaScript. Okay, raise your hand if you're intimate with JavaScript prototypes. That's amazing, so I don't have to explain them, right? Like, they're super easy. Okay, so we covered prototypes. So ES6, when it was being proposed, when this was a thing, we call this, like, ES 3000 or whatever it is today, I don't recall. It had a name, ES6, at the time, and there was a proposal to add this helper method on the string prototype called contains. And you can see the method signature, how that was supposed to work. You had a search string, and you had a position where to start. So this is like, you probably do index of for this type of stuff today, or you've done that for the past 20 years. And so here's an example, right? You have Norwegian for really good drink, contains AA, that's true. The second line, does it contain AA starting at the 1th first character? False, right? So browsers implemented this. So Firefox Nightly, we implemented this, and very quickly discovered, oops, this is a problem. So MooTools 1.2, arguably the best version of MooTools, had a method on the string prototype. So they were like prototype, they added convenience methods, sugar to native prototypes. And so they had something called contains, but it had different argument signature here, right? You had the search string, but the second thing wasn't a positional argument, wasn't an integer, it was this separator. And looking at these examples, I can't remember what it does, but you can just, it's enough to know they were different, right? One was a number, the other's a string, bad stuff happens. So we implemented this, and a bank in Germany broke. And if you're in the business of web browsers and you're breaking banks, that's not great. And so how do you solve this in Web Compat land? You just rename it, right? So if you use JavaScript these days, you might be like, oh yeah, we have string prototype include. So the decision there, the standards body said like, contains is not web compatible. Let's name it something else, and that's how we can solve that problem. Okay, another crazy issue with statements. You should not know what these are or use them ever. And I'm actually probably just going to skip this refresher, but well, let's cover it, right? So if you have this really awesome method called getValues, you pass in a thing, and then you've got this with statement, right? So you've got with, an expression. Expression is the thing, and then you've got the statement, which is return values. And so what that does is that broadens the scope lookup, right? It augments, so scope lookup normally happens in the execution context of the function or script you're running. And width, kind of like, you can just like dump a whole lot of extra stuff for that to look up. Everyone's nodding their head because that was very clear. So if you had an object called thing, and it had a property called values with the string lol, if you passed in getValues thing, it would return lol, and you'll remember with thing, so thing.values, return values, that's lol. Sorry, we had to go back and forth. So if you passed in an empty array, suddenly your function's broken because it's not returning anything, it's returning a reference to a function. So what does that mean? And so this was a refresher on how scope lookup in with statements happens, right? You've got this like additional scope context, and then you have the prototype chain. I pirated this from a book called Effective JavaScript by my friend Dave Herman. You should buy it. Sorry, Dave. And so this was exactly the same thing, right? JavaScript added additional stuff to the array prototype. We added this values method, and it turned out bad things happened. So you had some code, which I think this was Sencha Touch. No love for Sencha Touch in the audience. So you've got this method passing in this thing called values, and eventually what happens is, this thing, it expects that values to not be a function. It expects it to be some kind of other object, and so things explode. And what we do here is, so this was a problem because browsers are already shipping this. And so the TC39 folks, what they did was they invented this thing called unscopables. And so this is like a hilarious hack where it says all these properties, copy within, entries, fill, find, keys, values. If you're within a with statement, ignore them, right? So it's basically like, don't look at these things for these 7 or 8 things. And that was the easiest way out of this problem because people really wanted array prototype values and keys and et cetera. So that's kind of another strategy is like if you can invent new technology, that's okay, and everything will work, and you kind of, it's like you're inventing technical debt. It's really great. Okay, so the DOM is my personal favorite thing ever. I love the DOM. So let's look at an example of a web page. So this is an app that works for, it gives you sushi restaurants in New York City, which super useful app if you live in New York City. And so you've probably seen websites like this, right? They're like, oh yeah, turn your phone. No big deal. That's kind of obnoxious, and you turn your phone. And it says, wait, I was at landscape. I always forget. This one's portrait, right? It's like, well, okay, that sucks. So something's wrong, right? And so looking through the code, you can see there's this orientation event listener that's looking for this window.orientation property saying, if it's not 0, call bad orientation. And I promise you that's the name of the method. Like, they have opinions over at that website. Okay, so window orientation does not equal 0. We're going to do, if you look under your table, you've got 3D glasses. Thank you for looking. No, you don't. We're just going to pretend this is 3D. Okay, so we're going to access the JavaScript interpreters in our brains. This is a bit like if you go do a whiteboard interview. Undefined does not equal 0. Is that true or false? No one actually knows, right? It's true. You can double check in DevTools if you want. Undefined does not equal 0. True. Sorry, that's hard to read. Okay, so you remember this code. If true, call bad orientation, right? So that's problematic. You're always going to call bad orientation. And I guess that's sad. So what is window orientation? Does anyone know what spec that lives in? That was true at a point, right? So window orientation was this thing that Apple invented for the iPhone, and it was really cool. It allowed you to know which way your phone was pointing. Apple was really busy, and they forgot to write a spec. And so I did. And so this is kind of another solution. We'll talk about this in a second. But now, so sometimes when you've got non-standard stuff on the web and there's so much of it, all the browsers just have to implement that, reverse engineer it, and get some sucker to spec it. And so now this is like an interoperable, standardized thing. It works in all the mobile browsers. You can go ahead and use this. Okay, so let's move on to the CSS object model, the lesser of object models. We'll do another quiz. Okay, so vendor prefixes are a lot of fun. And so which of these work in shipping release browsers of Firefox, Edge, and Chrome? Safari also is implied there in Opera. So we've got lowercase WebKit transform, kind of bigger case WebKit transform, dashed WebKit transform, or just style transform. Any guesses? All of them and none. Norwegians are super extreme. It's all of them, right? Okay, so that's a little surprising, or maybe not. Okay, so but which one's correct, right? Like if browsers implement all that garbage, what does the spec say? The CSS Object Model spec, not the Mike Taylor wrote it in his basement spec. Guesses? 4 is definitely true, right? Like that's the standard way to access the style property on the CSS object, CSS declaration object, whatever the stupid interface is called. Guesses? Surprise, right? So this might be my fault, but the spec now says like these are proper ways to access those properties, right? You've got camel-cased attribute. That's what the spec originally described. So that's number 2. So if you've ever written any code to like iterate over vendor prefixes, you know that like, oh yeah, I should start with a capital vendor prefix and then the property camel-cased. And then when you tested it out in browsers, you're like, oh wait, no one actually does this the right way. Like WebKit implemented with lowercase, and Microsoft did its own thing. I think only Opera and Mozilla got that right. Okay, so but enough code is out there on the internet that you have to support it, otherwise things don't work. And then you have this dashed attribute, which is this number 3, people thought that was a great idea, and so we had to add support for that. Niche websites like Google Maps. Okay, so let's look at some CSS stuff, and I'm so sorry to make you look at CSS at a JavaScript conference. Trygve will issue refunds, I'm sure. Okay, so we remember we saw this OkCupid thing. If you had to guess, like, what is broken about the left-hand side? Clipping. Sorry? Clipping. Okay, good guess. Any other? Yes, I didn't hear what you said. That's probably the right answer. It's something to do with like background position X and Y, I think. You know how like you can do sprites and you can position things using background position. There used to be a thing called background position X and Y that was only supported in some browsers. Now we all support them. So that was, and they had a WebKit prefix. Okay, so people made web pages, only wrote WebKit prefix CSS and forgot to include the unprefixed CSS. Nobody in this room ever did that, but these were other people, bad people. So on the left-hand side, like what's your visceral reaction? Like someone says, oh, hey, that's what our website looks like. What would you think is wrong there? You should all be thinking Flexbox, right? Like this was like 4 versions old Flexbox. Like the super duper old one only used WebKit prefixes, right? This one has unprefixed. So the reality there is browsers have to implement aliases to all the WebKit prefixed CSS to the unprefixed CSS. So Edge and Firefox do this. Blink and Safari will never be able to get rid of their prefixes. Like it's just not possible. And so that's kind of the solution there is you just alias the legacy garbage and call it a day. It's problematic though. So when we added support for WebKit prefixed gradients, someone reported they went to this super hot website, stripe.com. I don't know what they do, like sell basketballs maybe. Web payments is what they do, okay. So that text is not normal looking, right? So we implement the gradients, but what the heck? This is what this looks like in Chrome. It's really hard to see from back there, but there's this magical gradient, right? The color starts at kind of purple and ends at kind of pink, and it's really nice. You can see that easier now, that like that's the color of the text. And so looking at this, like what's the actual problem here? It turns out, so Firefox supported WebKit linear gradient, but then on line 4 we have this other thing, WebKit background clip text. I could ask you like what spec that's in, but you would know enough by now to be like, oh yeah, Apple forgot to write one. And so I did, and browsers implemented this. And so now that works, right? Like that's Firefox. And it's amazing. Like you see that text and you just want to process credit cards, right? Like that's really important for the web. WebKit text strokes is another thing like this. It allows you to come up with these super cool text effects, right? Where you've got, so this is a combination of WebKit text stroke and WebKit background clip text, right? So you've got the gradient text, but also you've got this nice typographic effect where you're just stroking the letter. You're not doing the fill. If you don't support that, it's not the end of the world. Sorry for the vertical shift. I'm really lazy. It's not the end of the world, right? Like this is graceful degradation or whatever the term of art is. But this is so much cooler. So anyways, I wrote the spec for that too. And so that's the other compatibility strategy is write the specs for the things that Apple forgot to do. In their defense, they're very busy. Selling like trillions of dollars worth of iPhones and stuff. So, okay. I just mentioned maybe some controversial stuff like, oh yeah, we just add support for WebKit prefixes in other web browsers. Does that make anybody uncomfortable? Raise your hand if you're upset visibly. Okay, like that row in particular is not happy. They're like 4 rows up. I'm going to be going out that door. So at first, like, this was not something that I was comfortable with either, and it took me some convincing to convince the people at Mozilla, like, hey, we should do this crazy thing. And then you remember back to the web juice, right? Sorry to make you remember that, but like, what's important about the web? It's that people have access to information, experiences, content, right? Everything should look like that. Nothing should look like that on the left. And so the trick here is the one on the right is actually Firefox for Android today. It looks the same as it does in any WebKit-based mobile browser, and so that's what's important. I just like this picture, so we're just going to look at that. Okay, so you don't have to be super sad, right? So, like I said, I work on a standard through the What Working Group called the Compatibility Standard, and that's where we track. We've kind of just like the web standards community, not just me, right? Other people in other browsers work on this. We've decided that like these APIs are part of the web. They just are APIs with really crappy names, right? They just start with WebKit. It's just a poor name, but they're worth working on. It's not a ton of stuff, so that's great. And there's other stuff that other people have worked on through the WCAG, which is, I forget what that stands for, WICG. So this was like the non-standard Chrome file directory API that browsers have to implement now because important websites started to rely on it. Okay, so another thing we do sometimes, but very infrequently, is remove things from the browser. So show modal dialog, raise your hand if you've ever used that. Nobody, so that's cool. So yeah, one guy in the back, right? If you don't know what it is, that's great because it doesn't work anymore. And we only broke one web page. So Outlook Web App 2010, you can't add attachments to your emails anymore. Sorry about that. Arguably, it's 2017, and you have different problems. App cache is something that still works in the browser, but we want to remove that one day, so you should migrate to service workers so we can not break the web for everyone. And isIndex is a crazy old HTML element that was recently removed from the spec and from browsers. And anyway, so now that you're kind of intimate with the web compatibility problem and you're really fired up and motivated, you want to know what you can do to make this problem better or go away, we should be reading standards, right? So is anyone familiar with W3C? No, so W3 schools, W3C schools? Yeah, it's a fine Norwegian company. That's not the website I'm talking about. Find standards, What Working Group, W3C, read them. You should be testing your websites in other browsers. I know that's revolutionary. I don't remember why this guy's here. Pre-release channels are super important, and nowadays you have access to all of the big ones, right? You've got Dev Edition or Nightly, Edge Insider Preview, Safari Tech Preview, et cetera, Chrome Canary, and you can download these all. And my advice is just like every once in a while open your production app in Chrome Canary, for example, so you'll know that like, oh, in 3 months, shit's broken, right? And so you can fix it. Report bugs. Has anyone here ever reported a bug to a web browser? Like to WebKit, to Firefox? It's not very many of you. Has anyone ever felt like they found a browser bug? Probably a lot more. But sometimes you think, you're like, I don't know, my code maybe just, I'm doing it wrong. They're really busy and smart, and they're going to make fun of me. That's not true. We're not that smart. But now there's public bug trackers for everyone. Sadly, the Opera one is a black hole, but you can still report bugs to them. You just can't see what happens after there. Feel free to just like file bugs, and if they get closed as won't fix or invalid, that's okay, right? You don't have to feel sad, but you might help the browser vendors understand like, oh, we did a bad thing by fixing this bug or implementing this feature, and we're going to break your website, and your users are going to think you did it, and so we can catch that earlier. I also work on this website. My team does webcompat.com, and it's basically like a honeypot for broken web pages. And so you can just like report bugs there, and we'll try to figure out what's up and get those to the right people. Or if you're just want like an intimate bug reporting experience, you can email me and it won't be weird, I promise. And I'll even read it. So that's it. I'm Mike Taylor on Twitter. Thank you very much.
I love the casual walk over to the couch, like, this is so normal, and ignore all these people.
Can't actually see them. There's a light.
That's fine. That was a great talk.
Thanks.
You mentioned plumbers of the web. Do you ever actually feel like a secret agent, like you're doing these horrible, dirty things in the dark, and no one knows the blood that has been spilled to defend their ability to type like blink and have the text blink?
I was
Not
explaining.
that anymore, but
I don't feel that way. I was explaining to someone earlier, like I'm pretty dead inside after looking at. You look at enough darkness over the years, and you're kind of just like. I think that's how CIA agents end up as well. They're like waterboarding, no big deal.
I was going to ask you if you felt cynical. I think I don't need to anymore.
Yeah, sorry, that's like a really insensitive. Like torture is not okay. To be clear.
Yeah. I got a couple questions that were, what is your favorite and least favorite spec?
That's a good question. So my favorite spec, I think the HTML spec is really good. There's some cool people working on it. A lot of people work on it, but my friend's colleague and Anna and others work on that, and they're amazing. So it's really readable. And if it's not, you can file bugs and say like, I don't understand this, and they'll contribute. They'll encourage you to submit a pull request, and they'll help you through that, which is amazing.
That's cool.
Do
they accept pull requests to bring back the blink tag? Is that on the table?
Possibly. You know, if you can, if you can get like if you can get Facebook to depend on it, it'll be back. If anyone here works at Facebook, don't do that. Least favorite spec, probably the full screen API, just because it's a nightmare.
I heard some groans.
Yeah, like the spec writers have done a good job. There's just like this history and legacy of, you know, like Mozilla had one version, WebKit/Blink had another version, and then people went out and made websites, and then they're like, let's make a new version that's unprefixed. And right now, nobody can ship the unprefixed version because that breaks so much stuff. So it's kind of a mess.
Okay. So, I mean, a theme of your talk is you can't just break stuff, but in some platforms you can, right? Like Python 3, they just changed how it worked, and they can do that. And server-side languages, they do backwards incompatible changes all the time. Do you ever look at that and get jealous and think, like, I wish I could just fix all this stuff and not have to worry about someone's website from 2005?
So that's a good question. No, I don't. I still use Python 2.7. Is anyone here actually on Python 3.5? No, nobody is. So I think, like, reality is things will break. Eventually, you know, you have to consider like what's important for the web. Like ergonomics are super important. Top websites are more important than MikeTaylor.com, unfortunately. And so there's a balancing act there, but I think, you know, like the promise, I used to work at Opera up the road years ago, and our colleague Ola, he had a sign on his door. He had like a cave, and it said, all sites must work, right? And that's a pretty powerful promise, I think. And so that's kind of the magic of the web, right? You have a URL, you can share it, the content will work. It might, you know, maybe in 20 years it might not look amazing, right? Like even if all the CSS is gone, like the content is there, and that's important. That gets trickier, you know, as we do more and more client-side applications, for example, right? Like if you throw a random type error because you broke something, like your whole page might be hosed. But yeah, I'm not jealous yet.
Okay, in time maybe.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Please give him another round of applause. Thanks, Mike.